Welcome to our webinar on vulnerability lifecycle management. Check yourself before you wreck yourself. With me, I have Mahida, and where did we come from? We're working at MedCrypt. I started in the industry about 13 years ago at the Food and Drug Administration. I've been working on cybersecurity stuff ever since, including policy and laws that we're now working under. Interestingly enough, if folks don't know, I started with a PhD in chemistry working on novel antibacterial drugs. So of course, I would join you here today to host a webinar about vulnerability management. It just makes sense. Tell us about yourself.
Don't undersell yourself, Seth. But yeah, my name's Mahida. I lead product here in MedCrypt. Been working in the cross section of cybersecurity and healthcare for the past 7 to 8 years. Have always had a interest in privacy and cybersecurity ever since I got into tech. So excited to host this webinar with Seth today, and hope it's a good learning opportunity for a lot of you.
Thanks, and indeed, we have been thinking deeply about the problem of vulnerability management. We'll talk a little bit at a high level about vulnerabilities of all types and flavors, and then we'll dig into specifically third-party software vulnerabilities, which are all the rage for reasons that we'll also talk about. I think what's really interesting about this space, and maybe you could kick in some anecdotes here. There's a couple, we see this sort of these news bites all the time, but single CVEs, and obviously there are other types of unique identifiers for vulnerabilities, not just CVEs, but single CVEs have operational impacts, right? So we see examples of where a single flaw in a system impacts a industry vertical, and that draws all sorts of attention. I know that when I was in the hot seat at FDA during WannaCry in 2017, right, that I saw, and it was the crystalline moment as a policymaker, where you realized that the requisite information was not at the fingertips of the owners and operators to respond to these types of events, right? So I was fielding phone calls from HDOs and other types of owner operators in the healthcare space. Hey, Seth, can you please help me understand, get the manufacturer's attention? Am I vulnerable to WannaCry? That was a large part of our response effort. Maybe you could speak to your experience and then other industry verticals that we might experience this in.
Definitely. I mean, WannaCry was, I think, an eye-opening moment, right, for not just healthcare, but I think the general software and tech industry as a whole. And we saw it take down hospital systems, right? It had a very, very large impact in actual clinical care delivery. On the flip side, ever since, I think there's been more visibility into issues like single CVs taking down, having an operational impact. But the question I always ask is, like, how much better are we today than we were 10 years ago? And it's difficult to answer. We kind of, there's a later slide on the case study of Log4j, and I'll kind of give some insights into that now. Right, Log4j happened about over 2 years ago when it was first reported. Log4Shell was first reported as a vulnerability, like a very critical vulnerability with an easy attack vector for commonly used Java logging library called Log4j. And ever since then, there's been a very difficult progression on actually addressing that core issue of, we should probably patch or upgrade that single dependency because of the high risk it has. And there have been government agencies or in government systems that have kind of been brought down from nation states, exploiting the Log4Shell vulnerability. And it's, I think about half of all Log4j versions out there are still, they could still be impacted by that vulnerability. And it's, I think everyone thought, because of the awareness and the drive from everyone involved, right, from government agencies to the private sector, people would really address and resolve that one single issue. But here we're in 2024, and still a big problem. But I would, you kind of talked a bit about your experience at the FDA, and working in healthcare, working in the device space. We've seen the FDA be very proactive about trying to make sure device manufacturers are a step ahead of the other industries out there. I would love to kind of hear what is like, in addition to the WannaCry example, what is kind of the backstory and mindset the FDA has been trying to push in the industry and how to address this problem?
Thanks, Sam. Great question. So, we look at, and it's patently obvious to most folks in the industry, right, that the Consolidated Appropriations Act gave FDA additional authorities, including ththose around SBOMs. We see FDA move towards operationalizing that law in the form of policy, including the pre-market guidance, and then further operationalizing it in terms of E-Star and actually getting your submission in the front door of the agency. And folks may or may not be interested in the origin story, right? But the idea, those ideas, right? The words and concepts written in the law and the policy really come from the experience of everybody that was touching cybersecurity issues at the agency for the last 10 to 12 years, right? So where does it come from? It comes from responses to WannaCry, right? And Bluetooth and other, like, Log4j. I wasn't at the agency when Log4j hit, but like those sort of large scale, cross industry cutting, high impact vulnerabilities, and also like the day to day, medical device manufacturers submitting their devices or having post market issues and evaluating the root causes of those issues, and then writing down, hey, how do we get ahead of this? Right. That's primarily where all of that sort of legal and policy work came from. How do we stop these issues before they arise? Because when we look at FDA, what is FDA? FDA is a risk-based agency, right? They've looked at all types of risks through their storied career, mostly clinical risks, but they move and the laws are written in such a way to be flexible, to move into additional risks that emerge, right? Because you can't predict all risks that will emerge in the future. So you write laws that are flexible. In this case, they've gotten a actual specific law around cybersecurity risk. So the idea of cybersecurity drives risk. Risk comes from third-party vulnerabilities. We should pay attention to it. Drives the need to write policy and laws that dictate that. So when we look at the kind of framework that the FDA has put out, secure product development framework, language aside, being a policy writer is difficult to find the right language to describe things. The idea and concept behind a secure product development framework, and it's in the language of the guidance itself, is to reduce the number and severity of vulnerabilities. That's really the criteria. So how do we look at what the FDA is focusing in on? Well, they're focusing on a bunch of different stuff, but if we focus on for the moment on third-party software vulnerabilities, what is happening at the agency level, right? As we see a sample deficiency, right? People submit their devices for review to the agency reviews it, and they say, here's where it's deficient. They tell the manufacturer where it's deficient in the form of a written deficiency. We have an abstracted version there. So you can see, right? Risk-based agency puts out laws and policies, putting their money where their mouth is, reviewing devices and writing deficiencies and asking them to fix it. Meaning, you don't get to market if you don't address these risk sources, right?
And that's a huge deal, right? I don't know if we were going to go into anecdotes of like data we've seen in the past couple, like the past 3 months, right? Since the FDA really has been enforcing and making sure device manufacturers are following their cybersecurity requirements. But it's become a large issue, something that people kind of said, yeah, it's a good practice. We should be doing it, into a actual requirement device manufacturers need to follow.
Yeah, I think anecdotally, we work with manufacturers on a daily basis. Like we see the uptick in friction from all points in the secure product development framework from that perspective. But definitely we get a few a substantive amount of SBOM related deficiencies from sort of stock, like you're not addressing at all, to like sort of specifics about their particular case. And I think there was an anecdote recently, maybe it was the HISAC meeting from the FDA themselves. They're seeing, basically writing on average 15 deficiencies, again, for cybersecurity that have to be addressed by manufacturers in order to get to market. Which, part of this webinar is sort of to describe the we call it attack surface or problem set, whatever, however you want to say it. But like when we look at the totality of secure product development frameworks and what it's supposed to do, right? It's really an exercise in lifecycle management, right? The idea that a vulnerability has it can have many sources and it has to be discovered, it has to be assessed, and that has kind of have to be managed and mitigated. We'll focus on third-party software vulnerabilities today, but we would be remiss if we didn't think like this is all there is to it. That's not, and certainly the agency is interested in all types, all sources of vulnerabilities. They're a risk-based agency. They care about any risk source. It doesn't. Third-party software is just a focus today, but certainly they're thinking about other sources of vulnerabilities. So we'll dig into that today. The problem set's growing larger. So if we look at what the guidance document actually says, it says secure product development framework, and oh, by the way, integrate it with your quality management system. Oh, and by the way, the quality management system space and sphere is shifting. Recent announcement from the Agency of Harmonization with 1345, so 820, 21 CFR 820, the quality system regulations harmonized with this ISO standard 1345, which, by the way, maybe there's some more standard or harmonization aficionados in the audience, but I took a class when I was at the FDA at 2012 on harmonization. So it's only taken 12 years to get to harmonization. So good work, but it's a moving target, right? So the idea of we're doing something new around the secured product development framework, and we need to harmonize it with our quality management system, which, by the way, is changing, is a daunting task.
I mean, all of that sounds like a lot of work, right? The other side you talked about vulnerability lifecycle management, and there are 5 different sections on what to do and how to do it, and to actually execute on that, it's harder to actually do than just talking about it. But do you here you're kind of looking at zooming into the third-party software vulnerability lifecycle? How should product security teams at device manufacturers and healthcare really focus their attention in terms of making sure they're managing things like risk appropriately in the way the FDA is intending on them to do it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I came from an academic background, and academics can tend towards comprehensivity, and I think trending towards pedanticism, which means that we don't like to leave things unfinished. But I think in my mind, if we look at the life cycle here, I like to pull threads all the way through before I start to look at scale. So and identify problems. So if you look across the ecosystem here, across the life cycle, each one of these boxes: known vuln awareness, generate SBOMs, matching, manage the risk in a number of flavors, and alerting customers. I mean customers in all sorts of manners, like FDA, hospitals, patients, researchers. It can span the gamut. There's a problem set in each one of these, and I think that if we get wrapped around the axle around one particular one, and not complete a cycle, so to speak, that we can do ourselves a disservice. So we understand, and we'll talk about the challenges in upcoming slides. Naming software, known problem. Known vulnerability, database data cleanliness, matching software, matching those two things together, known problems, and a variety of methodologies to do it, and pros and cons of doing that. Managing the risk, the methodologies are I think we have a slide where there's 15 different methodologies. All right, pick one, right? Let's take, and we'll show an example of how we just sort of pick one, and we start with assumptions, and we know. I think the important thing is to know where the problem spaces are. We know this is only 20% accurate, or and we're going to go back and fix it. But we can't ignore that we have issues in these problem sets, and we need to work to increase the quality of the outputs of every one of these boxes. So it's definitely daunting. We can get stuck in one box and not finish the relay race if we don't just kind of pick one and move on. Speaking of problems, accuracy. So People, process, technology, that's how problems get solved. Tooling is really critical here. I know from personal experience, I know maybe you can share some doing this in Excel spreadsheets. I think the magic number for me before it gets really unwieldy to manage vulnerability information, which is effectively a data science problem at scale, is it runs somewhere between 5 and 10 SBOMs. Lots of caveats there, but it kind of gets out of hand really quickly. One of the problems that exists is accuracy in current methodologies for matching. Maybe you can talk about your experiences there.
Yeah, definitely. I was going to ask you, how much do spreadsheets scale? But it sounds like five SBOMs is the limit. One of the interesting things, right, we've seen in this space over the past 3 to 5 years, we've seen a lot of the tooling evolve quite a bit. We've seen companies that were historically focused on doing just SCA, right, like software composition analysis, get into the SBOM space, get into more vulnerability management space, as well as tooling that was kind of built around open source software management, right? Kind of managing open source dependencies, license management for that, and other things you would want to make sure you're doing from a legal perspective around open source software. Tooling kind of also started looking at, hey, SBOM is becoming a hot topic. We should also, right, add features to support it. One of the interesting things we've seen, and we kind of have been wanting to do for this for a while, but we did a couple of case studies with a couple of customers last year, and we saw that if we were trying to use existing tooling as is today, and then we use our tooling internally to compare the accuracy, because the accuracy is something we've experienced, is really critical for product security teams to do well, because when you're working with R&D and software teams, you need to make sure they are able to get the right information at the right time, so they can, and you need to build trust with them. And whenever you start sending a large list of vulnerabilities that have false positives, that kind of erodes that trust you have with the software teams, and starts leading to alert fatigue, which we've seen at a number of different device manufacturers and specific R&D teams who will just say no to product security when the product security goes like, hey, you need to update the dependencies, right? Or update the OS. There's high risk of maintaining that version in the field. And so with these case studies, we kind of looked at existing tooling, a combination of some of the open source tooling that's out there, and some of the commercial tooling that's out there, and kind of focus on two aspects of it. The open source tooling, in some cases was great, right? You could, if you wanted to scan an open source project, you could do it within minutes, get results. It's relatively easy to use, get up and running, but led to, in one of the test cases, led to a insignificant false positive rate. So almost 3/4 of the vulnerabilities returned were for components that were not actually used, or versions that weren't really utilized in that project. And that can be a significant problem when you're scaling across an organization and focusing on using one tool. Right now you have not just one team impacted by this. You could potentially have tens, if not hundreds, of different projects impacted by that false positive rate. On the flip side, we also saw an interesting pattern in false negatives. False negatives meaning it's missing vulnerabilities, and that is almost worse than false positives, because in one of the other case studies we'll dive into a bit more, it could lead to missing vulnerabilities that have known exploits that are on the SysLick list, and those are probably the highest risk vulnerabilities any device manufacturer should be paying attention to, right? Because they propose the highest risk. The federal government's kind of sounding the alarm, like, hey, you need to focus on the subset of vulnerabilities in the SysLick list, because we have intel on them being exploited in the wild, and they're relatively high risk vulnerabilities. Additionally, because of, I think, how software has evolved over the past 20, 30 years, in the combination of open source software being used, third-party commercial software being used, and then that middle ground of second-party software, a lot of tooling ended up focusing on specific verticals of like tech stacks, of open source software, and this ends up being way more difficult for a device manufacturer who's using a combination of different software, and shipping different types of devices to actually get the awareness and accuracy they need to enable in order to implement a SBOM and vulnerability management program at scale in the company and gain trust with the R&D teams. And the thing is, like, this problem isn't getting any better, right? I think when we started a couple of years ago, we talked about, one of the questions we asked, like, is there light at the end of the tunnel? Right? Or vulnerability is going to just magically stop coming out. And it doesn't look like it. I think you compiled this data from CVE.org about the rate of vulnerabilities. It's just increasing. It doesn't look like it's going to stop anytime soon.
Yeah, so I think we got a poll question hopefully coming out. Kate, I don't know if we did the second party one. What the heck is a second party? Like, we talk about first and third party. We just ignore second parties. It's fine because we don't know what it means. Anyway, second poll question hopefully coming out. Over and under, like what are we going to do for 2024? Are we going to have more vulnerabilities than 2023? My guess is that we're going to have more, but yes, 28,000 CVEs. And this isn't the only source of vulnerabilities, right? So VulnDB, I think boasts, last copy I saw 4 times the number of vulnerabilities than NVD. I can't substantiate that number, but it's 4 times the number of vulnerabilities that have to be processed in some particular way, which it could be great, right? Like more information, more known, known attack source and more sources of risk. We got to figure out a way to process all that information. What do you think? 2024, more or less vulnerabilities from than 2023?
I'm not a betting man, and I like sticking to the data, and the data is showing that the trend has only increased in the past 10 years. So I'm gonna say 2024 is gonna have more vulnerabilities than 2023. All
right, we're gonna hold you to that. We're gonna have a webinar to evaluate who went where in 2024, 2025 when the data comes out. Cool. So right now, my understanding of where we are as an industry is that we have what I call the single CVE disposition methodology, meaning that we take there are plenty of other there are other methodologies, but besides CVSS has known problems. It adds ordinal values, which is a big math no-no. It helps us. We focus on the number instead of the vector string. So it's like there's a bunch of problems that people have sort of written about far and wide. We won't get into that in a second, but it's directionally correct, I think, is the gist. It doesn't handle exploit information well. Like it's insensitive to things that have been exploited, and folks are working on additional methodologies and we'll see a list of those things. EPSS is probably the hot one today that people are looking at as an adjunct or to take over. But right now, CVSS is the one pointed to by the FDA. It feels directionally correct, but we're using it single CVEs at a time. By my observation, it requires a whole bunch of synthesis of information. It requires external information, it requires internal information, and those can be hard, right? So it's synthesizing internal information. I don't think we can get rid of the need for software engineer input into how the software is used, right? Yet, but we can go try to figure it out. But right now we have some significant constraints. We synthesize all this information together through a methodology to arrive at actions. Actions, roughly speaking, if the vulnerability is applicable, is to fix or monitor, right? And even when you fix, you kind of have to monitor, right? Because fixing could take a year, right? Depending on what the level of risk that's determined in the patch cycle that is used. And it changes, right? It could go from a fix in a regular cadence to fix in an emergency cadence. So there's this sort of continuous nature. We've got numbers upon numbers coming in every single year. We've got a methodology that's a bottleneck and a constraint. Oh, and by the way, it's continuous. In case it wasn't hard enough, a single CVE on this in a different part of the system, like it can be used in the same software that's used in different part of the system, has to be evaluated separately, right? The
I mean,
context
the system itself could be completely different, right? And how it's using that software dependency and how it's set up. Is this process something that we've seen work? Like, have any of the people we know in the industry been able to deploy, evaluating each vulnerability that comes across the radar and do it well? Because it seems like something that will just never end, right? If you're looking at every single vulnerability, trying to add input into the actual analysis of the vulnerability from the R&D team, from maybe quality and risk management, it feels like a never-ending problem, especially when medical devices are in the field for 10+ years, right? You have to monitor that for that long.
I've seen companies and business units attack it. I've seen them not attack it, and for good reasons, right? Like if they're fighting fires, right? Like this is an enormous task to handle. It can be overwhelming and daunting, and basically, hey, come to me when it's on fire, right? So certainly there's a gamut. I mean, the math, there's probably a formula for all my math aficionados in the audience. Can you write a formula that describes essentially the permutations and like the combinations? I don't know what the right phrase is that says this is mathematically nearly impossible. I think is what we're trying to get at. So we need to develop additional methodologies to try to scale this. And I know there's a number of folks that are in this arena trying to work it out. Here are some links, and I think the slides will be available so you can kind of go through and look at these methodologies. But we look at CVSS obviously as sort of the looked to de facto standard, I guess, if you want to call it that, all the way through EPSS there at 14, and then Oleg Usim, formerly of Edwards Life Sciences, now at Illumina. I don't know if he happens to be on, but he had done some work at Edwards on and published the work on HVSS, which he say, hey, help me validate this. So I think one of the problems that still exist, is that does it work? My biggest problem with CVSS and just methodologies in general is, did we get it? Like, how do we know that we made the right decision? Like, are the things that we're paying attention to actually the things that we need to pay attention to? I don't know.
I mean,
I don't know if we know that. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't think any. I think one of the reasons why, right, coming into 2024, there's so new methods coming up and how to actually evaluate vulnerabilities. And this isn't just focus. This isn't just a problem in like the med tech or healthcare space. This is a general software industry problem, right? Like, people are still trying to figure out what are the actual best ways of evaluating and assessing vulnerabilities in a way that can scale across an organization. It's something I don't, I think a lot of us hope will just have a magic solution, sometime soon. There's a lot of momentum behind CVSS4 and that having better metrics to actually, influence what the vulnerability risk is. But I think it's still an evolving and unsolved problem. And we kind of have to, as an industry, handle it like that, right? These methods are not they're not going to solve, allow you to walk away and automatically assess all your vulnerabilities, and you don't need to do any more analysis. I think the realistic workflow is that you can use these to triage vulnerabilities, right, and better understand where you should focus on, but you do need to do that actual analysis with a human in the loop to do it well.
Yeah, and that points to the next thing I want to talk about. I think there's a great deal of to be determined here, and I think research in this, maybe maybe I went to graduate school actually so that I would be skilled in the art of research, maybe for chemistry, but now vulnerabilities. I think we just have to apply a research hat, right? So this is a data problem. We can study and research and discover new methodologies. So one of the things that we have discovered through our travels, basically, that we could hey, can we try pre-selected vector strings called profiles? I'll just give you the concise version of the story. Basically, 99% of the profile-based assessments agreed with a single CVE disposition methodology. We even uncovered a systemic scoring problem and fixed that. So there definitely is some advantages to doing automated assessments. backed by science. You can look at the data yourself. Being a scientist, obviously, we disprove hypotheses. We don't prove hypotheses. So it looks like the data supports this hypothesis and doesn't disprove it. Basically what it came down to is this methodology was a 3 orders of magnitude cost savings from a labor perspective alone. Back of the envelope calculation, $100 per CVE. It takes humans, right, to get in a room and make these assessments, which has a cost. But if you can sort of extend their knowledge of the system and the interpretation of the vulnerability, that's effectively what this pre-selected vector or profile scoring did. And we need more data. We need to validate it. I think to our point is we don't 100% know. We need more data. We need more comparisons so that we can actually validate these types of methodologies. To your point about does it work? These aren't validated. I mean, if we don't if we don't come clean about that now as an industry, I don't know how we end up at a tried and true methodology.
Yeah, can you talk a little? So that cost reduction, right, looks massive. Can you go into maybe a little bit more detail about it and how did something that might have taken $6 million in resources go down to being so much cheaper?
Yeah, for sure. So the idea of using CVSS, so just a bit of backstory, like, again, I know that the issues with it, right? Again, adding ordinal values, it's not actually validated as a methodology, but it's directionally correct. So we started there, and there's some, sort of thoughts out in the ecosystem that we should keep it, just get better at it. So that aside, we stuck with it, and it's being used across major medical device manufacturers today. So we stuck there. The idea that you could take a system and look at data from humans, how they actually scored vulnerabilities, and just start to notice patterns, right? Like, hey, this system has properties, right? And those properties live inside the engineers' heads when they come to flip the switches and turn the knobs within the CVSS vector string. There are selections they make that are patterns, right? So if I'm in a part of the system that's not connected, I probably choose not connected, right? So the idea that I can extend that knowledge, right? I'm effectively representing the device or system, the device state through the lens of CVSS, per part of the system, was sort of the hypothesis that we're testing and then ran data through. So basically what you do is you take humans, you say, hey, what does this part do or have, or, tell me the sort of security posture of this part of the device, and you can represent that as CVSS. So you do it a priori as and proactive as opposed to reactive, line by line. So you can get economies of scale that way, and that's where that labor cost reduction comes from.
Thanks for that insight. I think it's something that given a lot of device manufacturers, right, really just focus on clinical care and clinical delivery, and that's super important to the mission of their companies and their teams. It's really important on like trying to figure out how can we reduce costs, how can we reduce resources to still come to the same end goal and outcomes we want, which is really being able to quickly triage vulnerabilities, and the more important thing is actually patch, right? The end goal we want is we need to update our devices, we need to update our dependencies so we don't have these risks on our devices that are deployed in the field.
Yeah, we got some questions coming in here. I love it. Thanks, Anthony. It's exponentially up. Yeah. So in terms of the number of vulnerabilities, vulnerability scans, periodicity, I believe probably need to look at your information specifically, but there's no what do you want to call it? Tried and true. I think annually probably is a good place to start. See if you can handle that. But it probably depends on what you can support in your organization. That's probably the constraint. Any thoughts on vuln scan periodicity?
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen be successful at device manufacturers of various sizes is doing it as often as you can, right? So for us, we know post-market vulnerabilities, need to be regularly monitored. I think Seth, that slide you had on number of vulnerabilities that come out annually and that number only going up, right, means that software you're shipping today, and once it's out in the field, right, there's a very high probability it will have vulnerabilities on it the longer it's in the field. So making sure you're figuring out how to systematically on a regular basis check for monitor and check for vulnerabilities as often as you can is really critical. Doing it daily, probably not scalable, right? It might be too much noise unless you're really ahead. You got ahead of the problem in the pre-market, so your number of vulnerabilities is just relatively low and your resources dedicated to it. What we've seen kind of be a common practice is doing it either monthly or quarterly as a practice of involving the R&D teams and having product security on a regular basis, monitor post-market for vulnerabilities that come out, and then engage the actual R&D teams on a monthly or quarterly cadence, because what that's really tying to is how often are you actually shipping updates, right? How often are you actually deploying those updates? And that kind of back channels, okay, how often should we work with the R&D team so they can get ahead and make those appropriate upgrades or patches? So when we do the next update and the next cycle, right, it will actually go out to market and resolve those security risks.
And then Anthony weighs in again about it seems like a more one of those problems where we have it's the permutations are more than atoms, more than there are atoms in the universe. It sounds like there's probably a formula we could and there's a blog entry there. I think Kate, can people click that link? Is that available to everybody that Anthony put out? Yeah, you can click on that.
I'm not sure. Can anyone who's on the call let me know if you can see the link in the Q&A? I'm not sure if everyone can see it, but I can try to resend it.
Got it. Thank you. And then another question comes in. Could you share some examples, insights, on how various strategies to monitor unresolved vulnerabilities while a fix and patch is being implemented?
Yeah. So one of the key things is having a tool or a system. I mean, you can start with a spreadsheet, but it probably won't scale. That allows you to take, the vulnerabilities you're getting on a regular basis, have visibility into them, about like what system are they impacting, what severity, what the severity score is, are there any known exploits, is it a SysAkev list, and then also track and the remediation progress, right? In terms of you're starting to triage your vulnerability, a fix is implemented, a fix has been shipped, in the same tool, so you can make sure, while maybe for example, if you look at I think one of the case study slides that talks about Log4Shell came out, maybe the tool you're using sends you an alert, or it came up in your dashboard. You're able to look at it, see which systems are impacted. You're able to alert the R&D teams or the product teams you're working with that are impacted by Log4Shell or potentially impacted by Log4Shell. You're able to track, okay, R&D is investigating it, so that vulnerability is in triage. And then whatever analysis the team gets back, like, hey, we need to fix it, we need to patch it. You can, in the same system, track that status. So that way you have awareness and you have auditability, right? In case, so a customer or an agency like the FDA comes knocking and asks you, were you impacted by Log4Shell? Right? What'd you do about it? And you have a auditability trail of, this is the analysis we did. This is when we were, it was brought to our attention. These are the individuals or teams that did the analysis, and this is, when or how we patched it. And it's much easier to compile that information if you're doing it in a centralized tool, right? Rather than trying to, piece a bunch of puzzle pieces together and being more reactive to that question.
Just to add a little bit, so what I've seen is when using CVSS methodology, and you look at sort of the temporal score section, hey, is this exploit, is it the worst case automated, exploits in the wild, something of that flavor. When you adjust those metrics, the score, and back to our problem with just paying attention to the score as opposed to the vector, the score doesn't budge. It's like 0.2 or something at the worst, from least to worst case. So what we've seen is, and getting to answer your question directly, adjuncts, adding adjunctive data points. We've talked about EPSS. Love the approach that group is taking. What to do with it? Mixed feelings about it across the ecosystem. But bring it in and say use it to flag things like this has a very high EPSS score, right? So the idea of, hey, we've got a vulnerability, we submitted a bug ticket, it's being fixed, on a cadence that's determined by the risk, bringing in information on some daily basis, right? It could change. Hey, this EPSS score is super high, 98%. Are we sure we has the risk changed? Is our cadence and and what we're going to do with it and how fast we're going to do it, is that still good, right? So you can bring in those adjunctive pieces of information and create systems where it flags it for you. Your question is actually to my sort of one of my overall themes that I hope people walk away with here too, is we're still figuring out. It's TBD, and we have to have flexible, like it's almost paradoxical. Systems which allow us to be in a regulated environment, but also flexible enough to adapt to what we learn over the next couple of years.
So I think we have like 10, 15 minutes left. Let's kind of go through the case studies real quickly, and then open the floor to more Q&A.
You've talked about Log4j a bunch of times. Anything that you want to add for Log4j, Log4j here?
No, I mean, the thing is, it's still a problem, right? There's a study done in the end of January, end of December last year, that said, almost a quarter of all deployed Log4j versions are still vulnerable to Log4Shell, which is, honestly shocking, right? And the bigger question I have is, how widespread of an issue is that in healthcare? I think one of the things that we see in healthcare that's difficult is, a device manufacturer might put a patch out, right? Or say an update's available, but it takes the hospital or the HDO even longer to actually deploy that fix or patch. So, I don't think it's a number we will get an answer. It's a question we'll get an answer to, but it's definitely something that, whenever issues like Log4Shell happen, it's really critical in making sure we're trying to figure out how to triage the issue as quickly as possible and get the appropriate updates and patches out to customers.
Good point. And I want to bring us back to the framer of vulnerability lifecycle, right? That lifecycle of Log4Shell is we're stuck in one of the parts, right? The mitigation part, right? So there are fundamental issues we have either as an industry specifically or societally as a whole, that we have to acknowledge, point to, and say, hey, this is a problem. We need to get better at it. I think a similar story existed around old operating systems, right? There's just some massive percentage of unsupported operating systems out there. So certainly we've got a constraint in our industry that we're dealing with. Case study 2.
Yeah, so real quickly, just for the sake of time, we spend a lot of time, I think the industry spends a lot of time talking about open source vulnerabilities and operating system vulnerabilities, which there's a good reason to, but oftentimes we overlook vulnerabilities and security issues on the firmware and hardware level. We've had a couple cases where customers of ours have a vulnerability for the firmware they're using or the hardware, the chipset they're using. They became aware of it from us and had to solder their board right before it shipped. And kind of make that a step in their manufacturing process, and it's the reality is patching and resolving vulnerabilities like for Log4Shell is it's still difficult, right, for us to actually do in the industry, but when it comes to updating firmware and hardware, that's almost an impossible task. So it's really critical to have awareness of these kind of security risks before shipping, right? And try to resolve them as soon as possible. So that once your device is out in the market, you have lower risk overall. And then firmware and hardware stuff always takes longer. One of the examples I have, the second one, it took 2 years for the fix to be merged after it was brought to the attention of that OEM, and that's just something that isn't going to change anytime soon. Skipping to case study number 3, I talked about false positives a bit earlier around like a commercial tool missing it. And it's really, it's a huge problem when it misses a high risk vulnerability. We had an instance where a commercial tool missed a vulnerability in the SysOCEV list. Is a vulnerability in the gRPC Java package. It had a high CVSS score, but it had a high, a pretty high EPSS score. And EPSS, for anyone who might not be familiar with it, is a probability of that vulnerability being exploited in the wild in the next 30 days. So the combination of that, along with it being in the SysOCEV list, and it also kind of being a bit of a rabbit hole to verify the vulnerability when investigating it, that combination of things kind of leads to an extremely high risk scenario where you might be, shipping a device or a software project, think you're monitoring it because you're using best what are deemed best tooling in the industry, but you're really missing the big picture, and you're missing the highest risk vulnerability you might actually have on the software device you're managing.
Operating systems.
I mean, operating systems is a right. rabbit hole in itself, right? I don't. This is when we look at vulnerabilities and security, operating systems are still the biggest risk. They're the biggest attack surface. It's a well-known problem, right? And has been for a long time. Microsoft has done a bit better job in updating the data in like the NVD around how they publish vulnerability data for specific builds of Windows. But it's not enough, right? In medical devices, we typically have custom patches and KBs installed on top of the OS. We've removed dependencies, right, from the actual OS because we don't need service, some Microsoft services that might be shipping with the base OS. It ends up, resulting in a huge problem when it comes to false positives, an order of hundreds of vulnerabilities, right, for that OS. And that, I think historically in the industry just goes like, it's too big of a problem, right? We're going to ignore it. We'll patch and update Windows when we can, and we'll just kind of take that approach and push it to the side. But that comes with immense risk. Seth, I think you've dealt with this, right? Even back when you were at the FDA, about device manufacturers not, paying attention to the OS side of things as much as it should be.
It's hard, I think, and we've had conversations with, Microsoft and other large OS vendors. Like, it's difficult to be able to describe a system to a level of detail to know its software state, right? We talk with manufacturers all the time that, like, they're also, sort of custom building things, right? Custom building their operating systems, which then also makes it harder to know. So I just, getting to that problem set that we're talking about, that we need to work through, it requires, coordination at all levels, right? I remember talking to somebody about Linux. They had, I think they were an owner operator. They had freezers in their environment, right, that ran on Linux. The board support packages for Linux were based around mobile, the mobile industry, so about a 3-year cycle. And after that, they couldn't literally even update Linux on the freezer, which had some operational consequences. They couldn't they couldn't monitor the freezer temperature remotely for storage of vaccines during the pandemic, right? So this notion that, yeah, it's hard, and there are problems that we could be working on from an OS perspective, like describing, working on getting tooling to describe your system at a level of detail that is useful, but also recognizing that there are constraints that we're absorbing from the supply chain that require more of a societal level fix or a legal fix to target OEMs. So it's definitely a huge problem, but we got to start, right? We can't just summarily ignore the risk that comes from operating systems. So I think, to your point, like, we're working on it and making progress. Wrapping up here, so we're at 9 minutes. I think. Some people are less comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty. I think as I've grown up over the years, gotten more comfortable with it. The law says you have to. So looking back at the Consolidated Appropriations Act and resulting regulations, the law says you have to, but doesn't tell you how. And it could be because we don't know or they don't know, and it's to be determined. So we really have to. And I mentioned this in response to WAG's question. What are some North Stars that we can sort of point to, a framework as we move through this sort of ambiguity and uncertainty? One, auditability. We have to be able to track what we do, when we do it, how we do it, so that we can look at it over time. You and I, we talked a little bit about validity, like, what does accurate mean? We don't have the benefit of, I'm going to bring in my chemistry background here, having a gold standard methodology that we can measure against, like, literally abiding by the laws of physics that we can say this is truth, which makes validity a little weird. But okay, we can try to get closer to it. We didn't really talk about quality system integration per se, but we talked about the importance of integrating vulnerability management and life cycles with the quality system. So looking at, paying attention to that, it's super critical. We're a regulated industry. That's how we function. Maybe a little bit about domain expertise. We are in a healthcare market. It's similar to a lot of other industry verticals, but then it departs in really important ways that we have to be cognizant of. And research and measurement, we talked about. So that concludes my regulated industry. Like, that is the stuff that we have to track and make sure that we're compliant in a way. I don't know how best to say it, but then there's this part that's like, hey, we're still figuring it out. So we have to have the ability to do research, to discover and measure. To quote, I think metrology is an actual discipline. So if we can put our metrology hats on and apply some scientific principles, I think at the end, some unknown number of time period, years probably, we'll end up with a way to handle this at scale. And then being flexible, right? The idea that CVSS is okay for now, but we need to work towards getting it better. As an example, is something that we have to be okay with for the time being. Any final closing thoughts before we open up for Q&A?
I mean, you hit the nail on the head, right? When it comes to this industry in particular, like the auditability, being able to validate somehow, right, and do the quality system integration bits is what makes domain expertise critical. Because it's unique to this industry. Other industries don't really have to go to the extent in terms of auditability and validation that healthcare needs to. And quality systems are a critical path to success and making change at a device manufacturer. And it's really, really important to integrate there and do what you can do to make it easier for the quality folks to integrate and make sure that the cybersecurity requirements are up to date and are being followed internally. One of the other things that makes this, the two other things that make this industry unique are the types of software we're maintaining is very different, right? It's not like we're shipping one web app to a server and needing to maintain and monitor it for security issues. We're typically deploying and maintaining devices in the field for 10 plus years, and it's up to the buyer purchaser to update it when you send a patch out for it. And so you end up with this really difficult problem of having almost every single version of your software you've ever built being deployed right in the wild, and needing to have some sort of way of managing that is very difficult at scale. Well said.
Thanks, Om, for going on this journey with me. We will continue for sure. Thank you to the audience for participating. I'd like to open it up for Q&A. I think we have one to get us started here from WAG. Could you speak to how to validate Vuln OSS or commercial scanning tools?
So it's kind of maybe talking about validating the results of like those toolings or those tools themselves. I mean, something that we've been asked a question about our tooling, and we typically will give some sort of report back. But Seth, do you have any like holistic approach to that? Like, should you should individuals expect vendors to be giving the validation reports? Should they be, in addition to that, validating the tools themselves as well?
I think the notion of validation comes from our industry, right? But we also want to know if it's true. There are a couple anecdotes I can share. So using multiple tools and sort of comparing results can be useful. I don't think that's pretty satisfying, and certainly there's a cost factor there. I in my own research use multiple tools to sort of compare results, and it's super interesting. So that's one way. I think the notion of like Part 11 compliance is a little weird for this if you don't have a gold standard, right? So I think the way to validate is to be determined. But certainly, like starting with some basic principles, like, does the software do what it's supposed to do, right? So some sort of validation report from the vendor itself, right? Hey, how do we know that it works, right? All the way down to like, one of the things I've done is like a manual audit. Hey, I'm getting the results from this tool. What results do I get? Because ultimately, like, that's what the comparison would be, right? Like, what would a human get if they went and did the same thing? Not a great satisfying answer, but certainly a methodology to get at it. I do think that, and I'm not sure exactly how to get at this, but like publish false negative, false positive rates, I think would go a long way. But then again, like, how do you know that the base rate is, right? How do you know what truth is, right? So it's hard to get your arms around some of this validation stuff. But those are a couple ways that I've been thinking about it. And mostly what I've heard is don't talk about validation, right? Like, because we don't necessarily have a great way to do it. And that getting to ambiguity, uncertainty, that's the ambiguity, uncertainty we have in our industry right now. We have to move forward together to figure it out. I'm not seeing any other questions, and we are at time. So it sounds like we're ready to conclude the call. Again, thanks for joining me, and having a lively discussion. Thanks for the audience participation, and I really appreciate the questions. All right.
Great. Yeah, thank you all for joining. The recording and the deck will be sent out after the session. And if you have any more questions, feel free to email us at info@medcrypt.com, and we'll be able to answer those for you.
Excellent. Take care, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.